Paper on the determinants of monetary policy frameworks in emerging and developing countries. My motivation behind this stems from the large amount of research that has been undertaken on exchange rate regimes. So how exchange rate regimes have been classified has changed significantly over the years. Initially, the classification was based on a very de jure basis. Countries around the world was able to just announce what their exchange rate regime is, and that is what they'd be recorded as. However, what countries were saying their exchange rate regime was, and what was actually happening, were two very different things. For example, countries would regularly self-classify as having a floating exchange rate regime, but upon further investigation, it was clear that they were actually fixing their exchange rates. And this is what was coined the term fear of floating by Calvo and Reinhardt. Over the years, better ways of classifying exchange rate regimes have come into existence, and these are ones that are much more de facto. However, this is important that we understand why this has happened, and the reason why is because if we are unable to correctly classify people's exchange rate regime, then we're unable to go on to say how each exchange rate regime has an effect on other macroeconomic variables, which is quite important to be able to do. Now, unfortunately, the same amount of research has not been undertaken on monetary policy frameworks, despite the fact that exchange rate policy and monetary policy are related. Now, until recently, a comprehensive classification for monetary policy frameworks did not exist. So this could account for part of the reason as to why this is the case. So Cobham has created a monetary policy framework classification which covers 186 countries, and this classification takes into account both what the monetary authorities say they're doing, as well as what they have actually done. And the definition that Cobham uses for a monetary policy framework is the following. It is primarily the objectives pursued by monetary authorities, but also the set of constraints and conventions within which their monetary policy decisions are taken. Now, there only exists one paper on the determinants of monetary policy framework, and that is by Cobham and Song in 2020, and this paper focuses on the determinants of monetary policy frameworks for advanced and emerging countries. Developing countries have been left untouched until now. Now, developing countries differ substantially from their advanced counterparts, particularly in the tools available for them to conduct monetary policy with, and thus their choice of monetary policy framework over time has varied substantially too. Therefore, this paper fills this lacuna by determining the monetary policy framework choice in emerging and developing countries. Here is a bit more detail on the classification and how I go on to use it in this paper. So like I've already mentioned, it now covers 186 countries and it is aggregated along two separate dimensions. So firstly, it can be aggregated by target variable, and this paper takes three categories from this: discretion, exchange rate and inflation targeting. Now if you actually go on to the website, the Monetary Policy Framework Classification website, you'll see that there are a lot more categories for that. I've aggregated further than the website has, and for reasons I'll explain later. Just to make it really clear, countries are classified as having a discretion monetary policy framework in all the years when there are no announced or even unannounced but observable quantitative targets. The exchange rate category that I'm using here is a combination of both fixed exchange rate and exchange rate targets, and hopefully inflation targeting is quite clear. The second way this classification can be aggregated is by degree of monetary control. And this paper uses three categories: intermediate, substantial and intensive. Again, on the website there is actually a fourth category which is rudimentary, but the countries that I'm using, this category do not appear enough to be included in the analysis. And as we go from left to right, so from intermediate over to substantial, we're saying that the degree of monetary control is increasing. To get a bit of a better feel of how choice of monetary policy framework has evolved over time, here is a graph for the emerging and developing countries spanning from 1974 to 2017. As you can see, in the earlier years, it was dominated by exchange rate and monetary policy framework, but over time, discretion has crept in and then started to dominate. And it isn't actually until the early 2000s really that we see IT creeping in, and even up to 2017 it's nowhere near having a majority. So for comparison purposes, let's have a look at how this looks for emerging and advanced countries. Now maybe the beginning looks a little bit familiar, although actually exchange rate and discretion are kind of on equal footing from the beginning. And as we go over time, discretion does dominate slightly, but as we can see, by the early 2000s, not only has IT crept in, it's actually taken over, it has a majority. And that's kind of where the key differences lie between this and the emerging and developing countries, where IT has nowhere near having a dominance by the end of the period. Okay, so now let's take a quick look at the data. So the data is from 1985 to 2017, and in total it uses 87 countries, which is including 2 currency areas, so the 2 currency areas within Africa. Now, here are a list of the variables and some descriptive statistics that are used in this analysis. I think most of them are pretty self-explanatory. There's just a couple that I think is necessary to expand upon. So the first one is anchor network. Now here, anchor network is defined as the largest ratio of the country's trade with each of the main anchor currencies to GDP. So the main anchor currencies that I've picked for this paper are the following: the US dollar, the French franc or the euro, the Indian rupee and the South African rand. Now this variable is used in the Copland-Son paper, but with different anchor currencies, which actually in turn builds upon something that was used in a Messner and Ohms paper. So as you can see here, because of my choice of anchor currencies, it's been specifically tailored for the countries used within this analysis. And then lastly, I suppose the one I think also maybe I need to quickly explain is this inertia variable. So what that's getting at is that it's getting at that a monetary policy framework, what you choose, it's actually quite costly or time consuming to suddenly move from it. It's going to be a big decision, a big undertaking to suddenly change your monetary policy framework choice. And therefore I think that's important to be included in the analysis. So the way it's measured in this paper is it gets given a 1 if your monetary policy framework choice today is the same as it was in the last period, and 0 otherwise. And then I've also included a dummy for years to just include year fixed effect. So we're accounting for anything that's kind of changed each year, but the same for every country. Okay, so onto my method then. So the dependent variable is a categorical variable. This is your monetary policy framework choice, be it by target variable, so discretion, exchange rate or inflation targeting, or by aggregated by degree of monetary control, so your intermediate, substantial and intensive. Now I really care about getting probabilities out of this, and therefore I've chosen to use multinomial logit estimation. This is also, because I've chosen multinomial logit, this is also why I wanted to aggregate the monetary policy framework categories as far down as possible without losing any sensible meaning. So multinomial logit estimation is a very brittle estimator, and it struggles to converge or struggles to estimate if you have too many categories, and therefore 3 seems to be optimal here. And I felt that I could do 3 without, like I said, losing any sensible meaning. So the results that are achieved via multinomial logistic estimation are log odds ratios. Now these aren't particularly easy to interpret, and also they're definitely not intuitive. So it's not really the results that I'm focusing on today, but by doing this I'm actually able then to achieve predictive probabilities of choosing each category for each variable, and these are the results which I will be focusing on today. Finally, as well as seeing how each variable determines monetary policy framework choice, the overarching research question here, it is important to be able to assess how well this model predicts monetary policy framework choice, and therefore I also look at prediction accuracy. And I compare that to the prediction accuracy of the model used in the Copland-Son paper. So before looking at results, I really do want to have a quick word about endogeneity, as that's a common problem with any kind of empirical application of macroeconomics. Now this paper, especially when it firstly started out, is just primarily a predictive analysis, and therefore rather than causal influence, and therefore endogeneity really wasn't the main concern. But I do feel that as well as predictive analysis, which is what I want to focus on, I do actually think that I've been able to overcome endogeneity problems. I don't think endogeneity is a concern here, and therefore I kind of want to explain why. So the two endogeneity problems that I do wish to talk about are reverse causality and omitted variable bias. So firstly, reverse causality. Well, what I've done here, which I think helps overcome this, is I've taken the average value of the preceding 4 years for pretty much most of the explanatory variables that it makes sense to do this for. Well, if something, so my dependent variable is something that's happening in time t, that cannot be causing something that's happened in previous years, and therefore that helps address this reverse causality issue. Now, as well as reverse causality being caused by that, what you could argue is, let's say we've picked a monetary policy framework choice, something that isn't inflation targeting one of the others. You could say, well, actually, because they've decided to do that, they haven't bothered, let's say, developing their financial markets, because they don't need developed financial markets to have the monetary policy framework choice they've chosen. So that could be an argument. The only thing that I think I kind of want to emphasise here is that, you know, one of the categories, quite an important one, a main one, is discretion. It's chosen quite a bit. Well, this isn't something that you would actively choose to be categorised as. So you wouldn't be saying, well, I'm not going to develop my financial markets because I want to have a discretion MPF and that's what I want to be categorised as. That's not really what discretion is here. Discretion is kind of like, you know, more like a lack of objective, that you haven't established it, or maybe you've got multiple objectives and they're conflicting. It's not really the one you're going for. It's kind of a transitionary monetary policy framework before you can like develop into something else. So I really don't think that's an issue. Okay, as for omitted variable bias, a few things here. So the variables that you saw in my data list, a lot more variables than that were trialled, but kind of going from like a general to a more specific model, I'm showing you the results of the specific model. Would have seen in my variable list, I included dummies for regions. This was an attempt to try and help overcome any omitted variable bias problem, because what I'm doing then is, by accounting for the regions, I'm accounting for anything that's kind of like within region, not changing over time, but that I haven't included an explanatory variable for. But you could argue, well, hang on a minute, why did you not include country fixed effects instead? Because obviously the regions I've included are quite large, and therefore there is likely to be quite a bit of heterogeneity of the countries in each region. But I do think that by including country level fixed effects, I would be limiting the scope of this exercise. I really want to be able to understand between country variation, like for example, how institutions affects these. And a lot of my variables that I've included in my analysis are incredibly slow moving. And therefore it might end up being the case, by including country level fixed effects, these are kind of, these are soaked up and then I don't get to talk about them. And also, in terms of how many countries I have in my model, I think if I was going to try to include country level fixed effects, I'm going to end up with some kind of like over parameterization problem. And I may even potentially be overfitting the model. And a problem with that is it's really starting to just capture random noise rather than any underlying pattern. So that's one of the reasons why I have chosen not to include country level fixed effects. And then when something similar was done in a paper classifying exchange rate regimes, they also didn't include country fixed effects, and it's for similar reasons that I've just announced. So I do think it's okay to not have included them. So now let's look at some of the results I've got. These are the results for by target variable. So I'm going to just pick a few to talk about because I don't think we have time to go through every single one of them. So let's start off with large. So this is coded as a 1 if they're large in economic size by a certain measurement that I've chosen as explained in the paper. So what we can see here, that countries, as they go from being small to large, so being large and compared to small, we see an increase in both discretion and inflation targeting. But we can see that there's a fall in the choice of picking exchange rates. Now this does fit nicely with the theory. Large countries in particular are probably less likely to be affected by swings in the exchange rate or exchange rate volatility, potentially because larger countries are more likely to be better diversified, and therefore if changes or swings in your exchange rate are less likely to affect you, you're not going to feel as much of a need to pick that as your monetary policy framework choice. And therefore I'm expecting the decrease in probability, as we can see by the results shown here. So that would fit in with my a priori expectations, and as well with the theory there. So now let's have a little look at this anchor network variable going on here. What we can see is as this anchor network variable increases, so as your trade with countries that are deciding to peg to this anchor currency in relation to GDP, we can see that there's a big increase in probability of choosing an exchange rate monetary policy framework. And this is exactly what we'd expect. We'd expect that if you're mainly trading with a certain sort of select ones of countries that already are pegging to an anchor currency, that maybe it's probably beneficial for you to actually join that network too, and therefore we'd see this increase in probability. So it's roughly increasing by around about 0.6, so 60% increase, which is massive. And then we can see there's the fall for discretion, and there's not much of a change for inflation targeting. So next we've got financial market depth. So as we can see, that as financial market depth increases, we see an increase in, you see an increase both in inflation targeting and for exchange rates, but the exchange rate is a slight increase in the beginning and then it kind of plateaus out. The one that's really interesting is your inflation targeting one. Now again, this is expected. It's kind of, the literature says that having deep financial markets is kind of deemed as a necessary precondition in order to be able to become an inflation targeter in the first place. So therefore I'd expect that as financial market depth increases, you're much more likely to pick inflation targeting, and that's what the results are showing here. Okay, another one I really wanted to talk about was central bank independence. So again, this is another one of those things where all the literature argues that, well, central bank independence is deemed sort of a necessary precondition in order to become an inflation targeter, because if you don't have central bank independence, then you're much more likely to have fiscal dominance rather than monetary dominance, and therefore actually having a price stability mandate isn't going to be maintainable. So as we can see here, we can see that as central bank independence, you do see that your probability of picking inflation targeting does rise, although albeit by not very much. And we see a fall for discretion, and exchange rate rises ever so slightly, but kind of just really stays flat, signifying kind of low economic significance for that. So I wanted to focus on the results that we've achieved on political arrangement. So how political arrangement is measured, it's from negative 10 to 10, so the more positive, so the more towards 10 you're going means they're much more democratic, and going towards negative 10 means it's much more autocratic. Now what we can see from the results here is that the probability of inflation targeting or picking that increases as you go from autocratic to democratic, but you actually find that it falls for both discretion and exchange rate. So I thought this was interesting because it fits in quite nicely with the literature. So Cobham 2022 states that autocrats typically do not like to cede power. And therefore it is highly possible that they'd view autonomous markets as a lack of control. And therefore it's not unsurprising that we see, as the political arrangement goes much more towards democratic, we see this fall in exchange rates, probability of picking the exchange rate monetary policy framework, but an increase in picking and inflation targeting monetary policy framework. So now we can kind of see how the variables determine choice of monetary policy framework. It's also important to look at prediction accuracy. So what I was really focusing on with this paper is obviously, picking variables that I think are going to determine, well, or the literature also suggests is going to determine monetary policy framework choice, but without kind of like, just including loads and loads of variables that are highly correlated and so on and so forth. I really wanted to have a sort of narrowed down precise list for this, and ones that make most sort of like economic sense based on the theory in the literature. So it's now important to look at how well this does go on to predict prediction accuracy. Now, prediction accuracy for this model is the following. So using multinomial logit, I can get it to predict the probability for every single country based on the country characteristics that's given in the data, the probability of it being in each framework. So for example, discretion, exchange rate, and inflation targeting. What I then do is I then say, well, hang on a minute, whatever the maximum one is the one that essentially the model's picking. So if we've got 20%, 30%, and 50%, then the one that's for 50% is kind of what the model is predicting as it's what it would say is its choice of monetary policy framework. And then using that, I see, well, hang on a minute, how many times am I right, essentially? And as we can see here, I get a prediction accuracy of 79%. Now, a few things about this, what's interesting. Firstly, the prediction accuracy on something similar done in the advanced country paper was 75%. So yeah, they're fairly similar. But why I think this is quite impressive is that, the data for developing countries is a lot harder to come across, or it's a lot more patchy. So I'm quite impressed that this managed to beat the prediction accuracy of something similar done in the advanced and emerging economies paper. Secondly, I'm looking at the countries that are basically never ever predicted right, and I'd be a little bit concerned, well, not only do I want a high overall prediction accuracy, be a little bit concerned if there's certain countries that it's just never ever predicting correctly. And I've only got one country that's an issue for here, and that's Albania. And when I look into the kind of the characteristics of Albania, I can kind of understand why it's predicting Albania wrong. So that gives me a little bit more confidence in my model. What's also important is to make sure that this model can beat a simple model. So as we can see, discretion is a big favourite among emerging and developing countries. And if you would just, say a model that always picks discretion, then this still beats it. So it comes up something like 63% of the time. So this actually quite outbeats a simple model that just went always picking the most dominant category here. Now looking at the results that I've achieved when aggregating by degree of monetary control. So I'm just going to pick a few like I had for the target variable and discuss them. So if we look at large here, we see that as a country becomes large, as opposed to being small, there's an increase in probability of having or choosing a substantial degree of monetary control, and there's a decrease in probability for the other two. So the increase in probability of a substantial degree of monetary control, is roughly around 0.2 percentage points or 20 percentage points. Now this is interesting. You might be thinking, well, why is it that there's this fall in the probability of intensive? Well, it can link back to what we were saying earlier. Maybe large countries don't feel as necessary to have such a strong degree of monetary control. Potentially their size allows the central bank to have leeway in terms of monetary policy in other areas, and so having that intensive degree of monetary control isn't as necessary. And I feel that kind of highlights the point if you contrast it with a medium one, where if we look at that intensive degree of monetary control from small and medium, there isn't actually that fall that we see for large. So maybe medium-sized countries compared to small still do need that intensive degree of monetary control. Okay, and then if we focus on financial market depth, what we see here is we see that as they deepen their financial markets, we see that the increase in probability of an intensive degree of monetary control increases quite substantially. So it looks like it's increasing by about 0.6 percentage points, so about 60 percentage points increase there. Now, again, this is kind of a result that I would expect. It could be that, you know, by the time you have much more financial market depth, you've enabled them to be able to have this higher degree of monetary control, and maybe it's not possible when you have such shallow financial markets. And then lastly, the one I wanted to talk about here is this central bank independence. So what can we see? We can see that as central bank independence increases, we see an increase in the probability for the intensive degree of monetary control. The intermediate, there's a slight fall there, but not massively. And again, there's a slight fall for the substantial degree of monetary control. But I kind of really want to hone in on this increase in probability for the intensive degree of monetary control. So having an increased central bank independence by a much more independent potentially allows them to use much more indirect tools for monetary policy as opposed to direct tools that maybe are not an option if you don't have this kind of central bank independence, and maybe you have fiscal dominance and so on and so forth. And therefore, these kind of like indirect instruments are key to be able to have an intensive degree of monetary control, and therefore this kind of aligns with what my prior expectations would have been for this variable. So then moving on from that, not only is it interesting to be able to say, well, how do changing these explanatory variables affect the probability of choosing each of the monetary policy frameworks by whatever aggregation you've decided, it's also again interesting or important to look at the prediction accuracy here. So what we can see is that the prediction accuracy, using the same way of coding prediction accuracy that I spoke about earlier, we can see that I on average achieve a prediction accuracy of about 84%. Now that is higher than the prediction accuracy I received when I aggregated by target variable. Again, doing what I did with the previous one, if we wanted to kind of compare this with a simple model that just picks the degree of monetary control that is kind of most prevalent over time, it does beat this, and it beats it quite substantially. So if we'd done that, it would have given us a prediction accuracy of around 65%. So as you can see, this is quite a lot higher than the prediction accuracy of a simple model, which again gives me a lot more faith in my model. What I could also have done is I could have just taken the average of both of the models and then saying that this is kind of the overall prediction accuracy, and that would have given me around 81.5%. As the overall prediction accuracy if I talk about both of them. In summary, my results show that countries that are large compared to small countries are less likely to choose an exchange rate monetary policy framework. And as I mentioned, this is likely to be because they're much less affected by exchange rate volatility. Large countries compared to small see an increase in the probability of having a substantial degree of monetary control, whereas the probability of having an intensive degree of monetary control falls. And I thought this was interesting, that maybe it's because large countries perhaps feel it's not as necessary to have such a degree of monetary control. I also find that countries that have a large volume of trade in proportion to their GDP, with countries that peg to one of the anchor currencies, so this is the anchor network I was talking about, they are much more likely to target their exchange rate and go on to join the anchor network. More specifically, the probability of choosing an exchange rate monetary policy framework increases by 0.6 percentage points once we go from minimum to maximum in terms of the anchor network value. And then lastly, as their financial market depth increases, there is a greater increase in the probability of choosing inflation targeting than there is for exchange rates. Unsurprisingly, deep financial markets are a necessary condition for inflation targeting, so it's a result that I was expecting to see. We do also see that this is the case for the probability of having an intensive degree of monetary control. Again, exactly what I would expect. So this is just a quick summary of some of the main findings I think that my paper shows. And then if anyone's interested, I also have shown in my appendices all of my results with confidence intervals as well.